Right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to YAYAS, and I'll just stand here because then the people on Zoom can see me as well in silhouetted spheres. Okay. The one or two notices to give out. Before I start, could I ask our secretary, David Brinklow, to say a few words, please?
I'd just like to say a few words because just before Christmas, we lost one of our longest standing members. Dr. Brenda Hayward died on the 20th of December. Brenda was on the YAYAS Council when I joined in 1978. So she'd been a member for a long time. She was York's first female archaeologist, I suppose, in that she came to work on the Roman pottery from York Minster excavations, and she was co-author of the volume on the Roman minster, the Roman remains below the minster. For YAYAS, Brenda was a very adventurous excursion secretary. She was a Romanist and she led the society up to Hadrian's Wall on a couple of occasions and to other places as well. She was an expert on Roman pottery, although you wouldn't have known that if you were talking to her, because she was incredibly self-deprecating. Her funeral will take place on the 20th of January in Carshalton. Because after she retired from York, she moved down to live with her son in London. Unfortunately, he predeceased her. People may remember Sir Jeremy Hayward. He was Brenda's son. So if we could just pause for a few moments to remember Brenda Hayward.
Thank you, David. It was just occurred to me walking in tonight, the Street Hub, I'll come on to in a minute, but you've got on your seats a flyer for our next talk next month, which is by Dr. Andrew Woods about the Rydale Hoard. So we've had him before talk about various coin finds. So that's on the 8th of February. Sorry, I haven't put my glasses on, so right. On the 8th of February here. So that'll be our next talk. It's on the leaflets that are on your chairs. It just occurred to me walking past the hub that having walked down Coney Street all my paltry 61 years, it was the old W.H. Smith's before 1977. I knew I recognised the site. And it's now much in use by community groups, one of whom, of course, was York Oral History Project, who recently celebrated their 40th anniversary. And I think Jonathan would like to a quick bit about that, as he's clutching a book.
Yeah. One thing relevant here with Jennie, that the Streetlife Project was very supportive to the York Oral History Society and allowed us to use the premises for our 40th anniversary back in October. But even more useful, we found they had a pot of money, and we had this long-standing book on the Mansion House, which was all the research was done during the Mansion House's lottery bid. The money ran out for actually publishing the book, but the Streetlife Project came forward and enabled us to publish the book. But it has a curious requirement. It is free. Such is the nature of the funding. We were unable to exploit the government even further, so we are making this available free. So I have bought 10 here, and I will bring some more if they're just over on the bookstall over there, if you want to help yourself on the way out. If they're all gone, I might bring another to the next lecture as well. And if you're on the Zoom, if you would email perhaps John, if you email John Shaw, then we can work out some means of getting you the book, by either by hand or post or what have you. So contact John for that. If there's a good demand for it, I will bring another lot next time. We've got about 200 left, so so it's just over there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. So Jennie says she'll take some questions at the end. I'm hoping if Graham's monitoring the Zoom, if there are any questions on chat, we can head them off at the end. So I'll do no further ado than welcome Dr. Jennie England. Thank you.
you. Good evening. Thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight speaking to you. Yes, I should still be able to see my script. Thanks. Just as a brief introduction, my PhD was on English medieval monasteries, in particular Westminster, Winchester and Gloucester in the 12th century. After I finished that in 2018, I held a postdoctoral position at Exeter Cathedral, where I helped to curate an exhibition on Anglo-Saxon forgeries. For the last 3 years or so, prior to my role at Streetlife, I worked at St Mary's Church in Beverley, which if you don't know it, I strongly recommend a visit, a really amazing medieval church with a fascinating Tudor ceiling. But since February of 2021, 2022, sorry, I lost the entire year there. I've been working on the Streetlife Project. And in addition, I've recently taken up the role as a research coordinator at York Minster. So lots of different hats. But today I'll be talking about Streetlife, the past, present and future of Coney Street. So Streetlife was a UK government funded project led by the University of York and the City of York Council, and in partnership with key local stakeholders, including the York Civic Trust. Its aims were to explore the role of heritage-led activities, experiences, and opportunities in the revitalisation of this historic high street, using Coney Street as a source of inspiration and location through the physical hub that we've just been hearing about, which is at 29 to 31 Coney Street. And here is a picture of our lovely painted front. You can change the slide. There we go. This painting went up over the summer, and actually prior to that it was hard to explain quite what we were doing or to grab people's attention, but the themes of the project are now wonderfully painted on the outside. So it started in December 2021 and was due to end in June 2022, but it's been extended to July of this year thanks to additional funding from the University of York. The government funding itself has ended in November of last year. The project's activities have been particularly focused around 3 themes: printing, music, and the street's heritage, each of which have rich traditions in the street. So the hub has hosted and indeed continues to host a series of exhibitions and events around these themes, open to all and free of charge. We have artwork on display, as well as offering printing and lino cut workshops. It's a venue for music performance and workshops such as ukulele or DJing workshops, and stories from the street's past are displayed on a series of exhibition boards on the inside of the building. It's a really lovely combination of things, and people stepping into the space get to experience a wide range of different activities. One of my favourite things is our small scale model of Coney Street. Can't quite tell from this photo, but each of these different blocks of the street can be picked up and moved around. And it's actually, I quite enjoy seeing kids come in and move it all around. And I say with great confidence, yes, I can put this back together. And half an hour later, I'm still, occasionally I find myself walking outside to see where does this building belong and kind of lining it up. But it's a lovely kind of tactile reminder of where you are on the street. So much of the public engagement items in the hub have been informed by findings uncovered by a team of researchers working for Streetlife. And these researchers were split across 3 disciplines, well, 4 technically, I guess: music, English, history and archaeology, with the history and archaeology kind of grouped as heritage. This research has uncovered a series of fascinating stories from the street's past, stories of lost buildings, ballads cried in the streets, and the lives of ordinary people in the city from hundreds of years ago. Some of the most intriguing new findings have been made by one of my colleagues, Dr. John Jenkins. I promised I'd have some writing up on the screen. It is 12th century handwriting in Latin, but hopefully you'll be able to pick out some of the bits. But in the course of his research, John discovered 13 charters dating from the 12th and 13th centuries in Durham Cathedral archives. 9 of these charters had never previously been seen by historians before, and the other 4 had only previously been known from printed editions from the early 12th century, from the 20th century, sorry, from which you can only gain so much information. Across these charters, we find new information about the city of York at a formative time, and particularly about the land on which the Guildhall is now situated. John artfully kind of traces the story of the Guildhall across these charters, and rather than me summarising it here and getting all the credits, I recommend you read his full blog on this, which can be found on the Streetlife website. And there you can also find other examples of the research discoveries that the project has made. In addition, there's a new touchscreen in the Guildhall through which you can explore some more of these findings. But John discovered a small but significant detail, which is picked out in the charter up there. The document itself is from about 1155 and has the earliest surviving written text for Coney Street. The name Coney Street, that is. Here we have Koningsstraat. Perhaps just about see that. Sorry for those on Zoom, I might not be able to pick it out. Koningsstraat in Iboraka, so Coney Street in York. Right, I think that's a wonderful detail. As you probably already know, the street's name doesn't have anything to do with rabbits, but instead it is the King Street, a grand name reflecting the fact that for much of its history, Coney Street has been one of York's most important roads. The street's origins are in the Roman period, when it lay between the river and the southwest wall of the garrison fortress. In the Middle Ages, the street was the site for important civic buildings such as the Guildhall, and at its centre, St. Martin's Church was one of the finest in the city. From the 16th century, Coney Street was York's commercial heart, with its shops specialising in luxury goods and providing a range of accommodation in various coaching inns. Looking above the shop fronts today, you can still see many high-quality buildings dating from the 16th to the 20th centuries. This is a lasting testament to the rich and enduring history of the streets. You may already know a great deal about Coney Street's rich past, but as indicated in the title of my talk this evening, I'll also be thinking about its future. Like many other high streets in the country, Coney Street has suffered with the growth of online retail and changing retail practices. And in the aftermath of the pandemic in particular, there are now many closed units and shop fronts. And I'm sure you've noticed this walking down Coney Street. Indeed, it feels a long way away from the King Street at the moment. However, as you may be aware, recently much of the street's riverside has been bought up by a York-based property developer, the Helmsley Group. Just before Christmas, they submitted to the York City Council their ambitious proposal for riverside development. In a few years, the whole area may look and feel considerably different. I'll come back to these plans in due course, but from what I want to do now, and indeed for much of the remainder of my talk, is to think more generally about how considering a street's past can help to inform and even shape its future. Much of this reflection will be specific to my experience and to this project, but I hope that by talking it through, you'll be able to get a general insight into the rich potentials of such an approach. So let's start with the key context of the project. I was hired to work with another postdoctoral researcher to deliver a series of public workshops in spring/summer 2022, organised in collaboration with York Civic Trust. The other researcher was Dr. Claire Smith, who's hiding among the group here, and there I am on the left, huddled over in the archives, one of my preferred things to do, actually. Claire is a heritage consultant specialising in heritage management and participatory conservation projects. In particular, she seeks to embed her research in practical casework. As you may be gathering, Claire and I have very different academic backgrounds. Hers in building and present-day research on placemaking, while I'm more experienced with medieval archival materials and things like the charter we were just looking at. And in fact, I think this image perfectly captures our differences. While I'm unraveling scrolls of parchment and using magnifying glasses and paleography skills, Claire sat on her laptop reading a PDF or outside pointing at things. She likes to joke that if something is written before 2010, she starts to think that it's outdated. Whereas for me, if something written after 1300, I begin to think that it's a bit too modern. Initially, it felt like we didn't quite speak the same language, but once we acknowledged that, it then became a delightful challenge to work out how best to bring our skills together to produce the workshop. Fundamentally, our role was to combine historical research, i.e. me, with current building and conservation policies, Claire, and to bring these together to shape these public workshops in which we and the workshops participants discuss the potential futures of the street. Now, I've used a similar turn of phrase several times now, using the past to think about the future. But you might well be asking, well, what does that mean? How does that actually work in practice? I'll go into that further throughout this talk, but in a nutshell, it required us to think about the ways in which the street functioned both successfully and unsuccessfully in the past, in order to see what lessons might be learnt or carried forward. In turn, recognizing the way the nature of the street has changed or not over the centuries can give a perspective on the ways the street might be able to adjust in the future. Now, of course, Coney Street has over 2,000 years of history to explore, a rather daunting task for a historian, particularly when I accepted that I might have to look at history after 1300 as well. However, the fact that the function of the workshops was to think about the present and the future provided me with a research framework that was structured around current policies and practices. To be specific, we had 4 workshops, each with its own theme. These were the public realm, meaning all the areas of the street which are publicly accessible, and this includes shop floors. Connectivity, how areas of the street connect physically and how these connections are navigated. Sustainability, here in particular we focused on environmental sustainability, that is green space, as well as health and well-being initiatives. And adaptive reuse, the ways in which buildings have been adapted and reused. This language is helpful for mapping onto current planning policy, but isn't always the clearest or perhaps inspiring outside of these contexts. So going forward, here I would like us to think of these instead as public space, its uses and users, connections to the River Ouse in particular, greenery, nice big term there, but the green spaces, trees, living plants, and finally, uses of buildings. I want to stress here that our focus, both mine and Claire's, as well as the project as a whole, was never about fully reconstructing the history of specific buildings on the street. Great work has already been done on this in the Coney Street Heritage Project conducted by the team at Fabrication Crafts and as part of a National Lottery Heritage Project. Instead, my focus has been on using these 4 themes to frame how we can use the past to think critically about the future. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to go through some of our research that was uncovered when looking at these themes. And from each, I'll start with one story from the past. From this story and its implications, I hope to show how insights can be carried forward into our future planning. You may find me making some arguments about potential changes and those that could be introduced, but I do have 2 key, more general desired outcomes for this talk. The first, that the themes that I talk through today give you an insight into the issues that Coney Street is facing. And these kind of insights in turn, you may be able to bring to your own reading of future development plans. And secondly, I hope that I persuade you of the huge potential of our combined multidisciplinary research approach, and in particular, the ways it can be used to engage the public in Coney Street's past, present, and future. I should add research that I'll be sharing this evening, and the research insights have come from across the team. So similar to when I was talking about John's research, I'll be repeating work that others have done, and the breadth of research is really testament to the work that the team has done. Okay, story 1. On Sunday, the 1st of January, 1832, after the evening service in St. Martin le Grand's church on Coney Street, there was a performance of Handel's Hallelujah Chorus. In addition to the church's organ, there was an instrumental band led by a Mr. William Hardman. Hardman would go on to conduct the church choir a few years later, in fact, the first such choir in New York. But on that evening, the voices were sustained by the Minster Choir, with, according to the newspaper report, the friendly cooperation of a few amateurs. I just want you to kind of imagine that sound for a minute. Singers come down from the Minster, some amateurs standing up and singing along, as well as a band playing all in that space. It must have been really remarkable. However, those stepping out of St Martin's on that Sunday evening will have encountered a very different scene on the street. From the mid-1800s to the outbreak of the Second World War, every Sunday night, Coney Street was overtaken by throngs of young people parading up and down. This event was called the Monkey Run. And at this time, it was the main way which young working class people could meet potential romantic partners. So between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. on Sunday night, Coney Street would be so full of groups of young men and women that 3 policemen were always on duty to keep the monkey runners moving, just to allow access to the street. Unfortunately, we don't have any images of the monkey run, but I'd like you to imagine this photo. This is from 1941, so a bit later than the period I'm talking about, but imagine they're full up of young people. Imagine having to have police officers just to keep them moving, the volume of people using that space, and in a particular way. On occasion, as you may expect, these gathered youths clashed with the police. In May 1885, 3 young women were standing on the footpath of Coney Street and were asked to move on by a PC Hawkins. However, they just simply laughed in his face, and they were promptly taken down to the police station and charged with obstruction. I should add here that if you want to know more about the monkey runs, a really amazing and fascinating kind of practice, I would direct you to the work of Laura Harrison, whose PhD and monograph provides excellent insight into these activities, and some of her arguments I'm following here as well. So in addition to arrests and charging, you might imagine there were complaints about the state of Coney Street on Sunday nights. And in fact, in 1871, the Lord Mayor described it as disgraceful. And that the following year, the York Herald reported on the, quote, Coney Street nuisance. And this concern about the monkey runs seems to be in part about the specific nature of Coney Street. In 1936, the Lord Mayor decried that the rowdyism on part of the young people had to stop because, quote, the street was a most important one used by people leaving places of amusement. The monkey runs on Coney Street certainly seem to present a really clear example of the ways in which the street's users might have clashed, and where kind of these groups of youths were obstructing the street's role as a place of genteel entertainment. However, I think it's also important to consider the monkey runs in a slightly different light. Primarily, they performed an important social function. This was a main way for young working class people to meet peers of different genders in a safe and orchestrated manner. Despite the reports from the newspapers, oral testimonies about the monkey runs suggest that these were highly prescribed activities. No horseplay was tolerated, and you had to be smartly dressed in order to participate. And in fact, Coney Street was a good and safe place to do this. Because of the high value shops on the street, it was well policed. There was also not an area associated with sex work. So by the first half of the 20th century, the monkey runs began to fall out of practice. This may perhaps be a result of increased traffic on the road, but nevertheless, it is clear that for a while, this street space was performing an incredibly important social function for young people across York. And although the monkey runs clearly had its critics, and those wanting a quiet exit from St Martin's after that performance of Handel might have been rather confronted by the crowds and crowds of young people. But I think perhaps rather than seeing this as a problem, we should also see it as a symptom of a street that was accommodating multiple users and multiple uses. So what use is this story for understanding Coney Street today? Well, I think primarily it reminds us that Coney Street has had and continues to host a wide range of people using it for different purposes. And that to be successful, the street needs to work and accommodate all these different users. And crucially, these uses and users can change dramatically across the day. Have you ever been down Coney Street at 8:30 in the morning? The typical sights. It's packed full of cars and lorries careening off the road, frequently onto the pavement. in our kind of research, we went out and filmed the street at different parts of the night. Different parts of the day, and I expected the night to be the period which was most difficult to navigate, but in fact it was the morning, and my camera footage is quite shaky as I step out of the way of a lorry heading straight towards me. So it's impossible to navigate, well, it's exceedingly difficult to navigate the street at this time of morning, but by lunchtime it's full of people walking, perhaps getting food for lunch or out shopping. And when the sun goes down, the street is transformed again. Given that I've just been talking about the monkey runs, you might expect me now to draw some comparisons between that behaviour and that of modern weekend visitors to York, perhaps out revelling on a Friday or Saturday night. However, as kind of indicated earlier, I went down on Coney Street on a Friday night at 10 o'clock, and it was remarkably quiet. It's there aren't, with the exception of a few riverfront bars, there are a few opportunities for nighttime economy on Coney Street, and certainly fewer than in comparison to other parts of the city. That kind of whistle-stop view of 24 hours in modern Coney Street, I hope exposes how one can experience several dramatically different versions of the streets across a day. However, within that, what remains consistent is the street's status as a throughway. Owing to its position between two bridges, it is and long has been one of the key throughways for people and vehicles moving across the city, and thus, in daylight hours at least, provides a steady stream of people navigating its public space. So, looking at the past use of Coney Street's public areas has revealed that it has always had a wide range of different uses. For the street to thrive, these need to be balanced and incorporated, and to fit alongside the street's core function as a throughway for people and delivery vans alike. But I think more than this, the example of the monkey runs and the concert in St. Martin's also highlights how historic Coney Street could be distinctive and attractive as a destination. And I wonder if the street's lost that a bit. I know from my own experience of talking to members of the public in the Streetlife Hub, most people seem to come to Coney Street to go to one shop, perhaps Boots or Waterstones or maybe the cinema, and then they leave again as quickly as possible. Or else they're using it, as described before, just to get across different parts of the city. This means that Coney Street's distinctive character as a whole is not being fully celebrated. Walking along it, you can move from 16th and 17th century timber-framed houses to 21st century shop fronts, taking in every other century of architecture as you go. This is remarkable and can really be easily overlooked. Distinctiveness and clear historic character is a key trait of a successful high street, and it can help to differentiate it from other competing locations and develop a national and even international brand. We only have to look as far as the Shambles to see that already in action. Coney Street has distinctiveness in abundance, and if properly celebrated and conserved, has the potential to contribute to both the character and economies of the street throughout the day. Right, that's that first story. It's quite a big topic. It took us from music on a single evening all the way through hints of international branding. But I hope you're starting to get a sense of how the past and present can be brought together and compared here. Our next story comes from the river. Exactly 43 years after the Handel recital in St. Martin's Church, on the 1st of January 1875, the Yorkshire Herald reported how, after an exceedingly cold period, the River Ouse had frozen. The sheets of ice extended all the way from York to Naburn Locks, 6 miles south. Citizens awoke to find the river transformed into, quote, a broad highway crowded by blithesome pleasure seekers, sliders and skaters. The reporter claims that thousands were on the ice, some sprinting up and down as fast as they could. Quote, although the accomplishment of that aim might mitigate against the grace and beauty of their movements, which I think was a polite way of saying they were all falling over. In what I consider a relatively intrepid bit of journalism, the reporter appears to have donned their skates and gone all the way down to Naburn Locks themselves, It reported on kind of waving at the different villages and people kind of from the bank saying, "If you come from York," and go, "Yes," and kind of exploring the ice all the way down. However, the reporter admitted that this was by no means an easy task, as the 12-mile return trip may be reckoned as above the constitutional as often prescribed. In a past life, I was a rower, and I can say it's quite tiring to row down to Naburn Locks and back. Can't imagine ice skating all that way. Thankfully, the newspaper report only mentions one incident. One of the captains of the 3rd degree fell through the ice, but was saved after a rope was thrown out to him. However, his hat and stick was left behind. A dog was sent for them and returned with the stick, but could not be induced to fetch the hat. But yeah, it's a remarkable little story there. Businesses backing onto the river from Coney Street were of course affected by this dramatic change. Overnight, special illuminations were made for the skaters, and oranges and confectionery were sold around fires that were burning on the banks or even on the ice itself. Locals appear to have devised cash-grabbing schemes by bringing out chairs for people to use while putting on their skates. You can imagine taking them from the dining room table and carrying it out. Meanwhile, ironmongers and skate sellers were besieged by customers. Less jovially, it was reported that the supply of water carried coal was rapidly being exhausted in the city, and consequently prices were greatly inflated. The Herald article ends with a reflection on those who are put out of work due to the bad weather, and highlights the work of the York Soup Kitchen serving food to the deserving poor. This is one of my kind of favourite accounts of Coney Street's past that I've read. It covers a huge amount, and as you may have gathered, the idea of the reporter canoe skates on and going all the way down to Naburn Lock has always really fascinated me. But more than that, it gives a really sharp insight into the relationship at that time between the street and the river. In turn, I think it implicitly reminds us of just how much this relationship has changed in the last couple of centuries. In the past, the river and the street were far more connected. Physically, there used to be 3 passageways called water lanes leading down from the street. The only one that still survives is under the Guildhall and is known as Common Hall Lane. Its entrance onto the riverside is still visible, but until the 1850s, this passageway actually used to lead all the way up into the street. You can see echoes of these water lanes from North Street. In fact, next time you're there, I'd really recommend looking across, and you can see these arches that have been filled in. The water lanes used to take people and goods to and from jetties on the river, helping to ease the traffic crossing the Ouse Bridge. Until 1863, this was the only bridge crossing the Ouse in the city. The water lanes also supported life on the street. They were used by people fetching water from the river, as well as depositing household waste to be carried away by boat. Unlike our experiences of the alleyways in Coney Street today, in the past, these were essential to life on the street. Also kind of hinted in the article about the frozen ooze, in the past, the river was an essential commercial bloodline for movement of trade and goods to both Coney Street and the city generally. Indeed, up until the last century, boats and barges continued to carry materials directly to businesses on the streets, such as newsprint for the Yorkshire Evening Press, as seen in this clipping. There is no way of escaping the fact today that Coney Street has turned its back on the river. Walking along it now, it's easy to miss that the river's there at all. At points, it's only a matter of meters away. Indeed, in comparison to other European cities, it feels a bit like we're missing a trick. But past and present examples can give us inspiration for how to reforge these connections. One of these main options could be through a riverside walkway. In the 1960s, Lord Esher presented his argument for a riverside walk that passed in and out of buildings, perhaps with breaks for garden spaces. He argued that this could be a key way of making sure that the new walkway wouldn't bypass the city, but instead bring interaction with businesses on the street, and likewise preserve and project out the distinctive character. Another point of connection to revitalise could be those areas running perpendicular to the river, that is to and from the Ouse. As mentioned previously, our current alleyways perhaps need a touch of sprucing up. And this could be done through simple changes of paving and lighting and how and where bins are stored, quite simply. An example of such an improvement can be seen here in these before and after shots from Wakefield Heritage Action Zone. It barely looks like the same alleyway. Just these simple changes really changing how the whole space feels. In turn, our glorious views down to the river, such as this one over to North Street, must be prized and protected rather than casually disregarded. To take this photo, I had to step in front of, like, past bins. You know, we have these big bins out. Again, it's part of how the street works and they need to be collected and emptied. But this amazing view just kind of popping out of Coney Street, being almost blocked off by bins, seems, yeah, such a shame. So more deliberate cultivation of existing connections will not only help to reconnect the street and the river, but also help to celebrate the amazing heritage assets we already have. Many aspects of Coney Street's historic connection to the river cannot be exactly recreated. For example, it feels unlikely that the Ouse will once again open up as an artery for regional or national trade. However, there could be options for public transport links on the river, such as water taxis leading to and from park and rides, or even down to the designer outlet. I rather like that as an idea. Getting on the boat, certainly easier than finding a parking spot. Nevertheless, when comparisons with the past kind of are made, there's another reminder here of how much has changed. And I think we should see this change as inspiring. The fact that Coney Street and the city as a whole has survived such a dramatic shift in its relationship with the river should, and indeed can, give us confidence that future changes can be just as drastic, and hopefully could be done with more ambition, optimism, and imagination than we've seen before. The Ouse isn't the only bit of water on Coney Street. Did you know there was a carp pond on Coney Street? Raise your hand if you knew there was a carp pond on Coney Street. For those on Zoom, we had 3 hands raised. Well, perhaps you'd like to tell us where it is? Either, do I? Yeah, absolutely. So it's in exactly, yeah. It's lovely, yeah. So it's in St Martin's Peace Garden, beyond the railings, and we were lucky enough to get access over the summer. And I'll admit, my colleague had said there are carp in the pond, and I said, no, there can't be carp in the pond. And here I turned out, and here was carp in the pond, and I nearly dropped my phone into the water in my excitement. It's really, really lovely. And so I'm hinting at kind of my third story here, and I hope you'll give me a little bit of leeway, because rather than being one kind of example, I'm going to be giving you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of greenery and green space on Coney Street. It perhaps won't surprise you to hear that in the past, Coney Street and the city as a whole was far greener than what we see today. Again, Lord Isha described it how the medieval city was essentially a city of gardens and orchards, and only slowly degenerated into a city of yards and sheds. As late as the 1800s, about a quarter of the walled city still consisted of gardens and orchards. This transformation came from the gradual encroachment of buildings and the slow eating up of land used for industry. And we can trace this transformation on Coney Street across several historic maps, which again is one of my favorite things to look at. So just to kind of situate you, number 10, sorry, you can see that. Number 10 is St Martin's. I'll use my clicker. Then there's Guildhall, Ouse Bridge, Spurrier Gate, there we're looking at Coney Street there and the river. So this is one of our earliest surviving maps and is from about 1680. And in particular, I want to draw your attention to the East Street, that is kind of the one not on the river, where we can see rows and rows of trees. I hope you can see that picked out. I take this not to represent one tree in the middle of the field, but instead perhaps a representation of these orchards we were just hearing about. And indeed, perhaps they grew apples to make cider that was drunk on the streets. And likewise, we see big open space on the riverside of the street, leading down to buildings or perhaps a wall along the river. Over the following years and centuries, this all changed. In this map from the 1820s, we see how that big space on the eastern side is being kind of eaten into. And again, that's the top half of the street. And again, when we click forward to the 20th century, that open space has again been further eaten into. We find only small separate yards. We're a long way away from those lush orchards. The areas did retain some greenery for a long time. The area around St. Martin's Church in particular seems to have been once full of luscious gardens. Here's a map from 1852, and we can see behind the vicarage, these gardens with paths and maybe even water features. Similarly, kind of up towards the Guildhall and all the way down the George Hotel, what is now Next, etc. And even beyond that. Imagine how impressive these gardens must have been to end up on a map. I mean, it's rather remarkable. And we get a further sense of this greenery from the slide I had up earlier. This is a bird's eye view of York, painted at around the same time as that map was made. Again, I hope you can orientate yourself from St. Martin's there. And here we see, I'm sorry that the colour's poor, this is how it is kind of preserved on the way that I accessed it, but I hope you can see these luscious gardens full of trees, obviously kind of mixing with other buildings, but a real sense of deep greenery. And for me, I found this completely transformative in how I think about Coney Street. This looks nothing like how I imagine it now. Some greenery has survived to the present, and in fact, most notably in the backyard of the Streetlife Hub. If you find yourself on Ouse Bridge, kind of looking along Coney Street, you can see some trees, and that's kind of at the back of the hub. But for, it's quite clear that Coney Street needs a more environmentally sustainable and indeed a greener future. The advantages of green space are many and probably already well known to you all. They include economic, health and environmental benefits, as well as making urban spaces more attractive and stimulating positive psychological and physiological responses. But lessons from the past also tells us that it must be the right greenery in the right place. A health inspector's report from 1915 highlighted the detrimental effects of a number of trees that were shutting out light to living rooms and bedrooms in residential properties in Waterloo Place. Waterloo Place was a group of houses that lay between Spurrier Gate and the river, and clearly these trees were so high that light wasn't getting into the properties, and clearly severe enough for the health inspector to be out looking at it. Nevertheless, current practices in other British cities show how trees planted in the right place, as well as depaving parts of the street, making green and blue roofs, and installing living rooms, can all contribute to making a high street a greener and healthier place. And it should be noted here too that when we've conducted consultation on what people might most like to see for Coney Street's future, greenery and green space are by far the top issues identified. Thus, there is not only a need for greenery on the street, but there is also an overwhelming desire for it. In that last story, you permitted me to sweep across hundreds of years quite quickly. I know we'd all perhaps like to look at maps all evening, but for my final story, I'll focus on just one evening on Coney Street, that of Sunday the 2nd of April, 1911. Does that date ring any bells for anyone?
Coronation of Joseph.
Great punt. A very tricky question, but it's the night of the 1911 census. It's often in April, 10-year increments. And through this snapshot into that evening in 1911, we get a real sense of life on Coney Street. I'm moving quite drastically from a lovely a picture to a pie graph, but I hope you'll forgive me. Because in this we can see a sense of what Coney Street was like and how it was inhabited. There were 95 properties on it in 1911, 44 of which were dwellings or tenements. 2 of these were vacant at the time of the census being taken. In total, 235 people lived on the streets. Over 2/3 of these were women. This gender skewing is likely because of the number of servants or housekeepers working in richer households. For example, Mr. Osborne, a dentist, lived in a rather large house of 9 rooms at the south end of Coney Street. He lived there with his wife and his daughter, both of whom were called Lucy, and they also lived with 2 female servants, Emma and Ellen. There were also a couple of female-only households. Here we have Miss Martha Goddard, who was the head of a 5-woman household. She and her sister Alice were both dressmakers, and also living with them was their assistant dressmaker, Kate Walker. 2 women were boarding with them, Alice and Bridget, both of whom were teachers at the York County Council School. Bridget was born in Ireland and had presumably come over to work in York and board in a respectable female-only household. The Goddards and the Osbornes lived in large houses. There were a further 19 houses recorded on the street, but not all were so big. For example, Mr. Wrigglesworth was the head of a 10-person household at 21 Waterloo Place. He and his wife, their 5 children, and presumably twin niece and nephew, they're both recorded as 2 years old in the census, lived there, as well as a boarder in a 6-room terraced house. It must have been an incredible squeeze. Besides houses, there are other ways of living on Coney Street in 1911. And this picture is actually from Waterloo Place. If you get a sense of the size of those houses and where the Wrigglesworths lived. But beside houses, we can see people living in different types of accommodation. We have flats and tenements, and in particular, a series of 5 tenements running just north of St. Martin's Church. These seem to have been quite small accommodations, only of a couple of rooms, and the occupiers were generally elderly and probably not very well off. For example, we find 87-year-old widow Christiana Brown living with her 50-year-old daughter, Mary. They lived in a 1-bedroom dwelling. This feels a long way away from the Osbornes and their 2 live-in servants. As well as house servants, we find other people who worked on Coney Street also living there. 10 people were recorded as living in office buildings, and 14 employers lived at the Black Swan Hotel alongside the proprietor and his family. You can hopefully just see the Black Swan picked out there. That is what is today Sports Direct. And even more than those living in the Black Swan Hotel, 43 people lived at Leek and Thorpe, the big department store, who specifically provided lodgings for its workers. And that's that rather large wedge of the pie chart here. And technically, that could count as people living where they worked, but similar to kind of in a shop that I'll come into in due course. But as they're all in one place, it felt for me to be its own category. And indeed, the part of the census for that record is remarkable. You can see sheets and sheets of young people living and working up in that building. A further 12 businesses on the streets were inhabited properties where 58 people lived. And this represents the 27% kind of here on this part, on the pie chart of the street's population. And these are kind of in the shop category. And this tended to be people living above, presumably, smaller family-run businesses. And for me, the census data has really transformed how I thought about Coney Street, thinking about it as a place where people lived, grew up, and helped to share the commerce of the street feels dramatically different from how I experience it today. Before I move away from the census, I hope you'll indulge me a final note on the evening itself of April 2nd, 1911. That evening, households were charged with recording who passed the night at that premises. At this time, York had a developed suffragette movement whose offices appear to have been in Bland's Court, just off Coney Street. Nationally, the suffragettes called for an evasion of the 1911 census. That is, to actively avoid being counted in the census on the grounds that if women did not count politically, then they should not be counted at all. So individuals left their houses and camped out somewhere else for the night, where the census enumerators could not identify them. And 21 people appear to have done this by spending the night in the office at Bland's Court. At the bottom of one of the summary pages of Coney Street's census, you find a brief note from the enumerator marking that 3 men and 18 women, you can see that at the side, this tally there, were suffragettes occupying a room in Bland's Court, Coney Street. I love that there one of the little addenda popped in at the bottom. I really wanted to tell that story because for me, it kind of sheds light on the richness of this material. From the census, we can get an insight into a multi-generational family living on the street, as well as the specific actions of a group of people who don't perhaps even live on the street, but are using it as a place to do something specific on that specific night. In addition to the information we can get from census data, trade directories can also reveal the uses of the buildings on Coney Street. In the second decade of the 20th century, we find a huge array of different businesses. Clothes and shoe shops sat alongside music venues and shops, grocers, confectioners, and even a gun shop. Many of the businesses on Coney Street weren't simply selling goods. They were also making and manufacturing these goods on site in the shop, we can presume in the yard spaces behind. In 1913, there were saddle makers, shoemakers, an ironmonger, perhaps whose predecessors had sold those skates for the skaters, printers, and even one of my favorites, an umbrella manufacturer. But it wasn't just retail that were in these spaces. Offices and professional services were also set up along the street. We find stationers, refreshment contractors, as well as, of course, the printing offices for York Herald. In addition to people living above the shop that they worked in some buildings, we find different businesses sharing the spaces in fascinating ways. For example, the gun maker, Mr. Horsey, was at number 10 Coney Street, but 10A is recorded as the offices for refreshment contractors, perhaps in the rooms above. And you may recognize this location on Coney Street, rather distinct alleyway. And this is next, Wallace Leakin Thorpe. I assume this is Mr. Horsley, sorry. And I speculated that this might be his son. You see a small face, but someone said it's probably the photographer. But yeah, I think it's rather haunting, having his head just popping out. Elsewhere on the street, up at number 7, which is today the clothes shop Mango, we find the offices of 5 separate businesses who we can imagine must have neatly split the space there in a kind of version of hot desking. So what might all these different examples tell us about the possible futures of Coney Street? As mentioned at the beginning of this talk, with changing retail trends, we have to consider the different ways that buildings might be used and reused. In comparison to the string of retail units we find today, 100 years ago, we can reconstruct a street packed with a variety of businesses, shops, manufacturing, services, as well as different types of homes and residential properties. In such mixed usage, we might find inspiration for an economically sustainable future. And changes to buildings' uses doesn't necessarily mean demolition. We have plenty of examples on Coney Street already of how buildings have been adapted and reused to meet new purposes. When City Screen was built in 2000, the new structure gracefully incorporated part of the old Yorkshire Herald building. As you may know, the W.H. Smiths, further up Coney Street, is in fact made up of 3 different buildings, each built at different points across the 18th and 19th century, but now gracefully incorporated. Once you get your eye in, you can still spot very domestic features, such as panelling grand staircases and fireplaces, nestled in amongst the displays of books and stationaries. Did most people already know that about W.H. Smith's? Yeah, I'd really recommend, if you haven't done it before, kind of step into the middle of the shop and look backwards to see where the buildings have been joined at the back, kind of just beyond the 1970s extensions. Really remarkable. And of course, what was once the huge Leek and Thorpe building is now made up of 3 different retail units, neatly divided across and between the original shop's grand 4 stories. Looking to the future, such a division of large units into smaller scales might provide a viable option for startups and independent businesses taking their first steps, like those we find in Spark on Piccadilly. When thinking about the future of Coney Street, we need to consider what new or maybe returning uses we'd like to see. We must also factor in how these might be able to combine to create a self-sustaining economy, and in doing so, help to breathe some life back into this historic street. So the 2 tasks I set myself at the top of this talk were to give you an insight into the issues that the street is facing today, as well as demonstrating the potential of the combined multidisciplinary approach that was undertaken during our research. And I hope that tonight I've managed to start to do both of those things, and perhaps even shared a story about Coney Street that you didn't already know. For this last kind of small section, I'm going to reflect on how this research has helped to inform the way the project has engaged the public in Coney Street's past, present, and future. Primarily, as described above, research that Claire and I did informed 4 public workshops exploring those 4 themes we've considered as well today. A core part of these workshops was facilitated discussion, capturing the feedback on what participants' opinions were on the street's future. In turn, the hub has been used as a venue for collecting feedback. If we return to our little model of the street, we see prompts and a series of questions inviting people to respond via post-its or cards left out. For example, design your own high street. What would you like to add? And through these, we found this to be a fabulous way of capturing what people who actually come to the street and use its spaces think the priorities should be. We've been able to kind of see and capture the opinions of families and children, as well as both tourists and locals. And again, as I mentioned before, one of my favorite things is to see kind of kids take the street apart and say, we want playgrounds everywhere. Or as you can see, we've got little models of trees that people can move around. Just poking out here is a little van that's always running up and down the street to represent reality. But it's been a brilliant tactile way for people of all ages to engage with the street and think about its variations. So far, over 500 items of feedback have been collected and collated, which in turn has allowed us to analyse what has been articulated as key priorities. For example, when we think about the items that people might like to see in the street's publicly accessible areas, these are the top 10 things mentioned. Seats, trees, greenery, street art, performance space, green area, playgrounds, lights, greenery on buildings, open space. And across this kind of top 10, you see what I hinted at earlier about greenery and green space being a reoccurring theme. And we deliberately kept these categories as kind of precise as possible so people could express the differences, but it's rather overwhelming the number of times greenery is up there. We've done similar things to assess people's thoughts on what they want to see in buildings, as well as along or on the river. Generally, we have found that our research has helped to provide a prompt for people's feedback. For example, most people find it easier to respond to an idea, even if it is to dismiss it, than to be simply handed a blank piece of paper and asked to fill it in. Here we have visual minutes that were captured during one of our workshops, in which people's thoughts and ideas were depicted and visualized. And this hangs in the hub. So not only does it serve as a record of that workshop, but also as a continuing prompt. And in turn, by sharing what has been already done here on Coney Street in the past, or what is being introduced elsewhere, we can help people to think and imagine beyond their own experience, and thus help to change opinions about what might be possible. And all of this is, of course, rather timely. As mentioned previously, many of the buildings on the riverside of Coney Street have been brought up by the Helmsley Group, who last month submitted a development plan. If you haven't seen it already, I would recommend you seeking it out via their website, which is represented here. The plan's key features, I'll just briefly summarise them here, but include the development of a riverside walkway stretching along much of the riverside bank. It has also included the development, or perhaps establishment of several routes down from the street to the river, as well as the introduction of new public spaces. For 2 weeks in September of last year, the Streetlife Hub hosted the Helmsley Group's display of their proposals, providing a space for people to come down and view the plans and leave feedback. In turn, they've been receptive to hearing the feedback we've gathered, making sure that plans reflect the needs and wants of the public can only be a good thing. As mentioned at the top, Streetlife is continuing into July 2023 with additional funding from the University of York. In the coming months, we'll be using the hub to engage people with placemaking initiatives throughout the city. We'll have programmed window displays and visually engaging representations. And through this, we hope to encourage further participation with structured activities and workshops in the hub. So in a nutshell, watch this space. We're really delighted to be continuing on and to be given this extra time to continue thinking about the future, not just of the street, but how it fits into the city as a whole. Now, I'm sure there are ideas, opinions, and plenty of expertise in this room that I would that I really enjoy to hear about your own thoughts and ambitions for Coney Street. But I hope you've enjoyed my 4 stories from its past and its future. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts or questions. Thank you.
It's fascinating, that chart from 1155.
That's good, isn't it?
Are there any questions? Yes, go ahead, in the back.
The evidence of mortgage of the river to bring goods in for the property.
For the benefit of those on Zoom, someone asked if has there been any evidence of wharfage that you've encountered on the river?
I believe actually wharfs were used in 2000 for the construction of City Screen, in a temporary basis. And I think again for some of the redevelopment of the Guildhall, and there is examples of wharfs being used in London in particular. So not only historically can it provide examples of how it could be used in this way, but contemporary examples could confirm the practical uses of using the river in that way. I said in the talk that there were parts of the connection between the river and the street that I don't see, I didn't anticipate as opening up again, but perhaps actually as we look to sustainable travel options or delivery options, the river could emerge as a big artery.
Yeah, Keith.
At the start, you were talking about those childhoods at Durham Cathedral. What's the connection with Durham Cathedral with Coney Street?
Lovely question. And I had a full 5-minute sidebar all about that, summarising John's work. And then realised we didn't quite have time to do it tonight. But it whittles down to an important man in York in the mid-12th century, giving the land where the Guildhall is now to Durham Cathedral, or to St Cuthbert. And they promptly gave it, he gave it to the Archbishop, who promptly then gave it straight back to him, I believe it's called Lethwin. And this seems to have been done, or John argues, he presumably did this so that if there's anything to happen to Lethwin or his heirs, the land wouldn't revert to the king. Instead, it would go to Durham, it would go somewhere else. And this is the beginning of the story of how that land ended up in the city's hands. That was a rather rough summary of John's work, but that's why those charters are there. And if you're interested, I'd really recommend following up.
Just to add some context, that's just 2 years after the end of the anarchy with William Fitzherbert, 1153. and Hugh Murdoch appointed as Archbishop in 1154, when Fitzherbert died in mysterious circumstances. Some say he was poisoned. It's a fascinating period, with land changing hands and people changing sides and scores being settled. Any more questions? Yeah, John.
Congratulations, I thought that was a fascinating and innovative way of presenting history as a sort of living subject. And one of the things that kept it alive in my mind as you were going through was the continual feature of, if I would say, the tension between the groups. I mean, transgeneration tension, with the sort of high culture and lower culture and style. There's obviously tension between the property owners. Surely between North there, between one end, you know, and the churches and so on. And of course, all these tensions generate dynamics. And I'm wondering whether what these tensions are, and I think there's probably a dozen at least, seeing how they develop over time and how they can develop in the future. You made a comment about satisfying everybody's requirements, but that's not the way tensions usually work out. It usually works out one of the tensions dominating the other. But I still feel that looking at it in terms of, you know, what dialectic disorders, I believe, but the viewpoint, see how it can work in the future.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. But boy, is that a big task? You know, what I think it has to be so context driven, that kind of interrogation of tension, where they come from, how they were navigated and mediated. And again, the work that Laura Harrison did on the monkey runs, I think is a perfect example of kind of thinking about how spaces, public spaces, have been negotiated and kind of navigated. And I think you're absolutely right. Understanding how those worked could provide valuable lessons going forward, and something that, you know, I think is great value.
Yes, Ian.
Your photographs remind us, Jenny, to look up in Coney Street. It has some magnificent upper floor levels. I mean, so does much of the rest of York, but Coney Street especially has some absolute gems, and it's a really good message to remind us to do that always. Look up.
Absolutely. I mean, I've lived in York for 13, 14 years. And the way I experience Coney Street has dramatically changed in the last year, as you'd expect. But a lot of that has actually come from, just as you say, Ian, looking up, kind of taking stock of the space. You know, it's the kind of thing that would be easier for everyone to do if there were places to stop and pause. It's very difficult to stop on Coney Street without, you know, being interrupted by traffic or people just moving through it. But finding ways in which people can pause and look up and experience the street as a whole, I think, could be a really, valuable addition to the street.
Margaret, and then we'll take some from Graham on the website.
You mentioned the monkey run, and I've got a bee in my mind about how much Coney Street must have changed when Lendal Bridge was built. Coney Street flows into Lendal, and really says things are separate. And that's because it's now a through route. It wasn't. You mentioned 1832. It wasn't a through route then. Has anyone studied how much Coney Street changed through route?
It's a very good point. Not that I know of. No, I don't know of anyone who specifically studied that change, but you make a real kind of crucial point there. That prior to that, the Lendal Bridge being built.
It's a dead end into what we now think. Well, you're next door now. Is that Museum Street? Museum Street is very different. It's a dead end there.
If you look at this discussion prior to building the Lendal Bridge, you find this was discussed because it wasn't through. So it's a major station, and one of the arguments would make it easier to get across the river at the time of this station.
So they did
I did. It's the way that it's the development of Helen Square that kicked it off in 1743, because stagecoaches had to go up Stonegate and then Petergate, and that was their route out of the city until 1834, when St Leonard's was created. And then, of course, it's like building a bypass on the A64. It leads to another bottleneck and another bottleneck and another. but it's very true that before Lendal Bridge, Museum Street, before even that was created, it was a narrow lane down to the river. And you literally had to wind your way down something rather like the width of modern Lendal towards the Minster. So of course, yeah, it's Lendal Bridge is actually like a giant vacuum. It's dragged people through Coney Street now, which may be the roots of one of the problems in the 19th century, that in the late 19th century, that it just drew ever more people because they knew they could get through. It's just a hypothetical, just a quick thought just came through my head. The fact that, you know, you're leading to one link, leading to another, a bottleneck cleared creates the next bottleneck, you know, and, you know, if they'd had their way, the 1971 Inner Ring Road plan would have had another flyover beyond Lendal Bridge, thus creating another perimeter to create another throughway, and we probably would have built a street right through the museum gardens. Yes, alternate universe stuff. I like to play with these. Can we take some questions off the internet, Greg?
Yeah, just in one from Vera, YAYAS is proposed to dig and develop an exhibition similar to the
When you say the two, do you mean? Okay, sorry, yes, yeah.
So for the benefit of the rest of you on Zoom, somebody's asked about YAT, who are proposing a dig at All Saints North Street. And what will that connect?
whether we should be in consideration.
Yeah, Mill Street and Coney Street as a twin.
Yeah, and I think obviously throughout this talk, I always remind of how frequently I'm saying Coney Street, Coney Street, Coney Street. I almost don't need to say it as frequently as I do because you know I'm talking about Coney Street. But in that repetition, I think I'm glossing over the fact that Coney Street doesn't operate in a vacuum. I mean, we've just been talking about that, you know, how it's connected and interconnected across the river, as well as, you know, visually, physically along the roads. And that is certainly kind of part of what, you know, any proposed developments of Coney Street needs to think about the city as a whole. And it feeds into a holistic vision, or how it can tie into other things that are going on.
I have a parting thought that seeing the latest Helmsley Group plan reminds me A, of Lord Esher's plan in '68, and B, the ASHED plan in 1948, and C, the plan in 1938. So if it doesn't come true, do we wait another 20 years before there's another plan? I've got just one from Keith Knight.
I was just going to make an observation about the monkey run. When I came to you in first in '86, the monkey run had moved to Middlegate. And I really in Middlegate. London, so it does still go on. And if you go to Coney Street, 7 o'clock is the time, 11 o'clock.
I was asked, it was closer to kind of 10:30 on that Friday night, and you know, I've had various bits of feedback saying, well, it wasn't a races weekend, it wasn't, you know, it wasn't a Saturday night. But I should have said, well, you know, monkey runs wasn't just a Coney Street thing. It was can be observed in other cities throughout the country, and obviously, yeah, but you know that monkey run.
After you go to 4.
Yeah, which is actually quite different from you know that traditional monkey run, which was far more kind of orchestrated. But yeah, I absolutely take your point, and yeah.
Yeah, just that, and then Angela. Yeah. He's asking if there are any plans for Spurriergate.
By which I assume you mean Spurriergate Centre?
Well, used to be a big cafe.
Yes, yes. Obviously, Spurriergate is a kind of a different thing from Coney Street, and the cafe is still there. Is open on kind of reduced hours, and is kind of obviously part of that, as we were saying, part of this looking beyond what is strictly Coney Street. We've discussed kind of Lendal, and yeah, I think exactly Spurriergate can be pulled into there, and they have been kind of, the centre has been partners as a venue for music performance as part of the project. So yeah, there's been kind of interconnection.
Angela, then Stephen.
Yeah.
Anyway, look, linking in with. I'm particularly interested about the use of the streets, the physical. Self, by use. So it's not only the listeners, which you were very well. It's civic parties, it's the use of the streets by groups of regional forces. First of all, this is the freedom of the city, and then going these days down to the museum gardens. I was wondering, and also the district things, and that's very much. Have you had any input, any ideas about this sort of groups of groups?
That sort of ties in with what I had a thought experiment 10 minutes ago, that the change in the nature of Coney Street with the creation of Lendal Bridge, because of course in the Middle Ages the route would have been from the castle, Nestgate, Spurriergate, Coney Street to that heart. So the direction is, you know, the last 800 years has flipped, whereas most people are now going the other way.
But I think it's amazing to think of it just as that kind of processional space, and it would protected space for that kind of I don't say performance in the wrong way, but the particular usage. And then we compare it to on those Saturdays where it's just rows and rows of people kind of moving, and again reminds us of this variety of ways that public realm or public spaces can be used on Coney Street. And it's certainly, it's not a simple answer. There's no simple answer to kind of how to incorporate all these different uses, but celebrating them, finding ways to kind of bring attention and kind of bring it into the life of the street and the city as a whole. I think it's really important.
Yes, Stephen Lusty.
Yes. Inspiration. And helping with workshops that you've been hearing about. There's inspiration when you think of the sort of thoughts that conceiving. It'd be wonderful if we could do that all over the city. It really would. Actually, it has inspired us. At the moment, not on the same scale, but looking at the history to see what it can do to inform us. Inspired by what you've been doing on Coney Street, and looking at you as a whole. And it's from projects like this that I think the conservation of the city and the future of the city can be kept in people's minds, so that we're not just overrun by developers when they arrive, but we're prepared for them and leave them in a way that the city wants.
Thank you.
I think that's a good place to end.
Yeah.
Thank you again, Jenny. It's very good. Yeah.